Now, so without any further ado, I think we can now begin with our first presentation, the class of 2008 roundtable, where we are, how we got here, and lessons learned. So as the title suggests, the members of class 2008 cohort will discuss what were some of their most beneficial aspects of preservation education in their experience that have helped them shape each of their careers and each of their perspectives on what kinds of courses or content can be added to preservation education in the future. Each member here will discuss their unique and interesting career trajectory over the last 14 years and how it was shaped by their HPP education. And participating in this roundtable discussion are Ed Fitzgerald, Senior Associate and Senior Conservator at Jablonski Building Conservation, Maya Haptis, Senior Consultant, Main Street's Fourth Economy Consulting, Natalie Lord, Principal and Founding Partner of Form and Works Design Group, and finally Ashima Krishna, who would also be moderating the session, Associate Director, Purdue Policy Research Institute, and Assistant Professor of Practice, School of Interdisciplinary Studies, Purdue University. So over to you, Ashima. I can stop sharing my screen. You can start it.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. That was a great introduction. Let me see how I can share my screen. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so as Angela mentioned in her introduction, we thought this would be a great opportunity to reflect a little bit on some of the things that we have learned along the way in the last 14 years and how our time in the HPP program and beyond has shaped us as individuals, as preservationists, as professionals, and how that can perhaps be useful for current students and future preservationists. A quick note about some of the panelists, as Angela mentioned, Ed, Maya, Natalie, and I will be part of our discussion today. We do have 4 other classmates who unfortunately couldn't join us, and you see them down below on the screen: Leanne, Kristen, Katie, and Lindsay. We do have a little bit of sort of sad fear of missing out, if you will, that this is a virtual event, because as you can see, we have a little bit of a tradition of having some fun with our class every time we get together. And that's usually at the expense of Ed. And so it would have been fun to have this in person and really recreate our series of images in 2022. But maybe next year or another time would be a great opportunity to get together. But you know, that's been a fun tradition that our cohort has had, and some fond memories along the way. Oh, and I forgot to add, one of these is photoshopped. We photoshopped Ed into one of those images. So without further ado, let me get started with our first speaker, and that of course is Ed. Ed, take it away.
Thank you, Ashima, and thank you to the committee for having all of us. Appreciate the opportunity. So I think each one of us is going to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our background. So I came to the program directly from undergrad, where I had majored in history, but as an undergrad research assistant, I learned that historians spent a lot of time in dark, dank basement archives, and I realized that wasn't quite for me. So I wanted to find something that where I could combine my love of history with my interest in historic architecture, and stumbled on the field of historic preservation. I tried to do my homework and learn about the fields of preservation before heading down that path, but I still didn't know that much about the field, particularly specializations within the field. I applied to and got into HP programs all around the country, but I ended up at Cornell, probably because one, I would say the prestige of the university. Two, Cornell offers a stipend, or at least did. And then three, Michael convinced me that the Cornell program was flexible and that each student could tailor the courses to their specific interests. So, so I started to find what I thought would be my path within the profession during my summer internship with Historic Scotland. There, I worked for an organization that was trying to promote traditional trades and rebuild lost skill capacity in the workforce that is necessary to do the actual preserving of things. In the UK, I learned about these brilliant statistical studies that had been done to quantify the number of skilled workers needed in each trade. These reports didn't just bemoan the lack of skilled masons or plasterers. They were actually used to create new apprenticeships and training programs at trade schools to rectify the problem. Aha, I thought, this is a really great idea. And so I went about trying to replicate one of the UK traditional trade skill studies here on a smaller scale as my thesis. That was an interesting exercise, and trades training is still an issue that I believe is crucial to what we do, but I didn't quite figure out how to turn that niche focus into a career. After a couple years in Ithaca, I had even more diverse interests than when I started with the program. So I took a second internship after I finished my coursework, an internship with the National Park Service's National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, or NCPTT for short. And that introduced me to more of the hands-on side of things as I worked on studies evaluating traditional additives to lime wash and the effectiveness of paint strippers on old bricks. But after that ended, I had difficulty finding work in the field. We were in the middle of the Great Recession, and I got stuck on my grandiose thesis and hadn't finished. Eventually, I managed to convince NCPTT to hire me back to develop a wiki for preservation called Preservapedia. And that turned into 6 years at the center, which is really where I found my true calling. I worked on a lot of different projects there and was exposed to some of the best and brightest in our field. But the thing that really enticed me there was the center's research on historic building materials. I wanted to become an architectural conservator. But it seemed like other people who specialized in that area had degrees in conservation. How could I get there? Would I have to go back to school? But I came to realize that NCPTT could offer its own sort of education. I wanted to learn how to do, if I wanted to learn how to do paint analysis, I just had to volunteer to organize a paint analysis workshop for the public and put myself on the class list. If I wanted to develop skills with a particular material, I could just set up a research study. And so it went until I found myself sporting a new title, doing exactly what I wanted to do. Oh, whoops. You can advance the slides, Ashima. Sorry. All right.
More, or is this it?
That's good. Thank you. Actually, yeah, go ahead. Next slide, please. My first projects as a conservator had me working on NHL level properties, troubleshooting coating systems at Alcatraz, developing custom soft bricks to repair plantation slave cabins. And in my last project there, working on a conditions assessment and treatment plan for what may still be the oldest structure that I worked on, a 1727 plantation house in Tidewater, Virginia. eventually, looking for a change of scene, I got a job with Jablonski Building Conservation in New York City. Slide, please.
Absolutely. Ed, this is also your 5-minute
Okay, thank
time
you.
warning.
My first projects with JBC included restoring a modern mosaic mural by artist Joyce Kozloff and developing treatments for finishes at the Walter Gropius house. As an architectural conservator, my interests remain diverse, and that is one of the things that I find so appealing about this field: diversity in what we do and what we work on. One day, I may be performing cleaning tests on the stone fort at the base of the Statue of Liberty. The next day, I may be hanging from a swing stage 30 stories above Times Square, surveying an Art Deco skyscraper, or putting the wings back on an angel statue. If you asked me 16 years ago, when I first stepped into Sibley Hall, what I would be doing now, I would not have guessed that I would be hanging off the side of the Brooklyn Bridge, identifying stones for Dutchman repairs. Today, though, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ed. Our next panelist is Maya Haptis.
Thank you, Ashima. And yeah, thank you to the committee for having us and giving us a chance to spend some time reflecting on our careers thus far. And for me, it's been really fun to look back at what I considered a somewhat circuitous route to get here, but it maybe is a little less circuitous than I thought. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And Ashima, you can just go ahead and advance to the next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting on my education and work experience. And so I received a BA from Bard College in the year 2000. And then I was offered a job at the American Institute of Architects Pittsburgh chapter. And so I worked for that nonprofit, providing mostly administrative support, event planning, and continuing education programming for architects, even though I had very little architectural background, working with those architects, especially within the city of Pittsburgh, which was sort of a new home to me coming from California originally. I wanted to I was inspired by the work that they were doing and pursue a career in historic preservation. And I was particularly interested in the Cornell program, like Ed said, because of the opportunity to really tailor and select different elements of my own education, as well as the fact that it was within the city and regional planning department, which was something that was highly important to me coming from that background. And so upon completing the program, my thesis was titled Solid and Salvable Action Housing Incorporated and Urban Renewal in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I looked at a project in the mid-60s by a local housing rehabilitation firm, Action Housing here, that was the first small-scale response to the large-scale urban renewal projects that had happened in Pittsburgh in both the Hill District and downtown areas. And so following that, so prior to the thesis, I wanted to mention as well, as Ed did, that I did my summer internship with the not as Ed did, but mention it as Ed did, with the city planning department in San Francisco. And so I did research and helped to form a historic district in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco of properties that had survived the 1906 earthquake, and then went on to do my thesis in my second year. But I wanted to focus in a little bit on the thesis because at the time I really thought I would end up working within that intersection of affordable housing and really the rehabilitation of existing buildings to create that affordable housing, supply that we really need, particularly just because I wanted to come back and do work within the city of Pittsburgh, and we had so much of that existing building stock. But instead, I applied for and was hired as the business district manager for a local community development corporation called the Lawrenceville Corporation in the Lawrenceville neighborhood here in Pittsburgh, and it was an arts and design focus at the time. And so I ended up doing really very straight up Main Streets work, implementing facade rehabilitation programs to incentivize business owners to restore their historic facades, doing marketing for the neighborhood, business attraction and retention, and really just connecting people to resources. And so through that work, which I did up until 2014, I learned a lot about community development, about neighborhood planning, and of course about Main Streets. It wasn't something I necessarily anticipated I would be working in, but I really enjoyed working with small business owners, and was really happy to be able to have discovered that through this position. And so because I was working in a neighborhood in Pittsburgh that had an emerging nightlife district, and the city of Pittsburgh was doing a lot of planning around what we call responsible hospitality, or how business districts and neighborhoods can better plan to respond to the way that business districts have shifted more to like 18 and 24-hour business districts themselves, I was hired as the first nighttime economy manager of the city of Pittsburgh. And so I ran that program for about a year, and had always thought that I might want to work in city government, and discovered after about a year that perhaps it was not the best fit for me. And so I stepped back and did some freelance writing and consulting. I served as a city design editor, doing writing and editing for Next Pittsburgh, which is a local publication here, consulted and edited for grants for other community development corporations, and eventually was actually rehired as a contractor by the American Institute of Architects as the editor of their online magazine for architects. So I did that for a number of years until 2019, until I was hired as the director of the Clemente Museum, which is a small boutique museum we have here in Pittsburgh that's dedicated to Roberto Clemente. And it's actually housed in a historic firehouse. And so there was to be a rehab of that. Unfortunately, in 2020, the museum was closed, and it still exists, but we were closed for a long enough time, as well as having baseball be canceled. We didn't have a number of attendees, and so I lost that job. So in 2021, we can go to the next slide. In 2021, and the rest of the room, so most of 2020 and 2021, I was a third grade teacher and on unemployment, third grade teacher in home for my children. And then just at the end of 2021 and starting in February 2022, I've been able to come on with Fourth Economy, which is a private economic development consulting firm. And so we focus on economic strategy, equity, and resilience. And you can go to the next slide, Ashima. And so we have a process that we work with communities. We respond to RFPs and RFQs for different municipalities, local government entities, nonprofits, and private developers who are looking for economic strategies. And so this is the process that we use. And then I wanted just to spend my last little bit of time talking about my main project here. If you can move on. So I spent about 50% of my billable time working on the Allegheny Together project, which is a Main Street strategy. So the Allegheny County Economic Development is my client. They're the redevelopment authority for the entire county. And so we actually work in main streets, any main street within the county that's outside of the city of Pittsburgh. So much more small scale than I'm used to working in. We provide strategic planning and technical assistance. And so I just wanted to give a quick example of some work that we did. It's actually prior to me coming on, but pivoting during the COVID-19 pandemic to show businesses that were open and providing services so people could actually zoom in and figure out, where they could walk to pick up food and things like that. So I spent about 50% of my billable time with this project. And then as the firm applies for any, projects that include a Main Street strategy or business district strategy, then I come on and work on those projects as well. So another component of that is also providing a lot of community engagement experience, which I gathered from a lot of the work that I did in the nonprofit sector. So I think that's closing out my time a little bit, but hopefully we can talk a bit more during the Q&A, and I get to pass it over to Natalie. Or no, to Ashima. That's right. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I switched it around because I thought let's keep it alphabetical. Okay, so excuse me. Let me start the timer. I am Ashima Krishna, currently Associate Director at the Purdue Policy Research Institute. I am also serving as Assistant Professor of Practice in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies here at Purdue University. a little bit of a background of some of the spaces and places where I have been. I did my undergraduate degree in architecture from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, India. And then I ended up coming to Cornell in 2006 and part of this awesome cohort for the HPP program. And similar to the sort of sentiments shared by Ed and Maya, one of the things that attracted me to the program was its sort of relative flexibility in curriculum. Also, I really felt like I had a good rapport with Michael even before meeting him. And then another really interesting sort of thing that drew me to the Cornell program was that it was housed in a planning department. And coming from an architecture program, having worked in an architecture office and done some of that work, I kind of really wanted to push myself out of that spatial constraint that often architectural practitioners find themselves in, and really begin to think of sort of preservation and conservation more from a city and regional and urban perspective. And I thought that the program would really help me do that, and it did. It also ended up, so pretty much I think the first or the second semester, I knew that I wanted to continue down this path. And I was pretty certain I did not want to practice. And I knew that I wanted to go into research. And so, of course, going into the doctoral program, therefore seemed to be an obvious choice. And then I decided to stick with Cornell, of course, for a number of the reasons I already stated, even though there were some other good, opportunities at preservation programs elsewhere in the country. And, it was a really, those 8 years spent first in the HPP program and then in the PhD program, really have been ones that have shaped the trajectory of my career and beyond so far. From 2014 to 2020, I was the assistant professor of historic preservation and the director of graduate programs in historic preservation at the University at Buffalo, in Buffalo, New York. In the middle of the pandemic, in July 2020, I decided to give up that position and move to Purdue, where my spouse was, so that our family could be together in the middle of a deadly raging pandemic. And so it's been a really great opportunity to sort of pivot a little bit from the preservation world. But there have been so many parallels that have occurred in these kinds of spaces. And there have been so many lessons that I have drawn from my experience, first in the HPP program, then in the PhD program, being at Cornell, and then having to, and then of course, being at Buffalo, and then applying all of those things in a slightly different trajectory here, which is not necessarily preservation related, but very much sort of more urban, more sort of health and well-being concerns. And so the Purdue Policy Research Institute is located in the Discovery Park region of Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. We have 3 main areas of focus, strategic areas of focus. The first area looks at defense, security, and space. And as you can imagine, that's not my area at all. So that's not what I work on, but my colleagues do. The second area of focus is health, well-being, and the future of work. And that's where a lot of overlap comes into play, particularly when thinking of the built environment. And for example, a lot of the projects recently that we have been looking at have been dealing with food insecurity. And one very interesting overlap with historic preservation has been some of the projects that we have, or some of the communities that we have been talking to in Indianapolis are looking at adaptively reusing old churches or old historic properties in the more blighted areas of Indianapolis and thinking of repurposing those as spaces to grow food for the local community. And so that is a really that's a space where it really comes full circle. And it's been a very interesting experience to begin to expand on some of those issues more locally. And then the third area of focus that we have here is peace building, development, and sustainability. And of course, as you can imagine, there are some overlaps there as well. And so some of the things that, that that continuity that I talked about earlier begins to show up in the research that I have been involved with over the last 15 years or so. And, some of it really started before, but the most obvious ones, when we had our class trip to Pittsburgh in 2006, for example, we went to a place called, and Maya, correct me if I'm wrong, Churchworks Brewpub, is that right? I think so, yeah. And so that was an interesting example because they had repurposed an old and vacant church as a brewery and a restaurant space. And coming from India, from a very different context, that was fascinating to me. And that's something that I then, continuously sort of thought of in the subsequent months as, how do I begin to translate this into my own context and my own worldview? And so that led me to my master's thesis. And that's where I looked at this really sort of very interesting World Heritage Site, which is a large cultural landscape in the southern part of India. And looking at sites there, and I was really beginning to think of, okay, so, there are all of these ways in which religious spaces or sacred spaces in other parts of the world are being repurposed for different uses. Now, is that something that's really possible in the Indian context, and in particular in Hindu temples? And then that, of course, brought me full circle back in Buffalo when I was there as an assistant professor and ramping up my research. And then, looking at how local communities in the city of Buffalo, in the more blighted parts of the city, are repurposing some of these abandoned or vacant Roman Catholic churches that had been vacant for many, many years, and were often in under threat of demolition. And so, for example, in this image, you see a former Roman Catholic church was converted into a Buddhist temple by folks in that area for their use. And so that sort of, you begin to see how there are all of these connections that follow through. And then, of course, a second continuity that I have seen throughout has been my interest in local urban conservation policies. And I use the word urban conservation very deliberately, going back to Trudy's keynote address from yesterday, with very similar kinds of concerns about the limits of historic preservation as a term, and really then thinking of urban conservation as a holistic process. And some of those things began to also, I began to think about during a trip with Michael and other colleagues to Hampi again in 2009. And then, thinking about sort of more broad, complex urban issues and some of the policies that impact how urban development takes place in historic areas. That led to my doctoral dissertation and fieldwork in the city of Lucknow. And then a more recent research project in Buffalo before I moved here that looked at the demolition or the process of landmarking the now demolished blocks of shoreline apartments that were designed by Paul Rudolph. And so there have been sort of all of these different ways in which there have been very clear sort of connections and threads that have been impacted my research trajectory. And I see that continuing now as I transition into a new position at Purdue as clinical associate professor in the John Martinson Honors College beginning this fall. And so I'm excited for that new opportunity and to get to explore all of these continuous threads with students in the years to come. And a little bit of a self-promotion, my co-author Manish Chalana and I published sort of a collection of essays on contemporary approaches and challenges in the post-colonial period in India. And these are some really interesting essays by academics and practitioners from India and other places that are discussing Indian concerns. And so if there are folks that are interested in this, you can try and check it out and see if some of these could be helpful to you. And with that, I will get it over to Natalie.
Thanks, Ashima, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. We can start on the first slide, Ashima. So what I found really fascinating about our class was that we had a very variety of backgrounds and kind of different things that brought us to the program. So I'm going to start way back at this age. This is me and my family at Mesa Verde. So I was born and raised in Colorado. And it really started with my rotten brother there on the other side. Next slide. So one Christmas when I was 7, he got this book on a little fellow called Frank Lloyd Wright. And I quickly stole the book and just flipping through the pages and just super inspired by this craft of architecture. So I decided at the age of 7 that I wanted to be an architect. And I still have this book. This is a picture I took the other day to get ready for our slides. So fortunately, I did at some point apologize to my brother for stealing his book and taking over his career path, but he found another calling. So my story really begins in architecture school. I started a program actually here in Colorado at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is their program is a 4+2, or at least it was at the time. I think they've changed it now. So you basically did an undergraduate in environmental design and then a master's degree in architecture. But about 2 years in, well, actually after a first year of architecture school, my then boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband of 19 years and a few months, he was stationed at Camp Pendleton out in California. So we decided to, throw caution to the wind, get married, which obviously has worked out. And I transferred out to the New School of Architecture and Design in San Diego. So that program was a Bachelor's of Architecture, which is a 5-year undergraduate degree. And I was able to sort of jump right in and not lose any time. So I was able to finish it in the 5 years. But during that period, I actually started out thinking I wanted to do custom residential. And part of the New School of Architecture program was that you took classes in the evening to allow you to actually intern at architecture firms. So I started out in the custom residential field as an intern up in Oceanside, California. And my boss, who was a great and fascinating man, kind of carved out this niche in custom beachfront, where all the lots were about 19 feet by 40 feet. So everything started to feel very much the same to me. And I was like, I don't think my calling is in custom residential. So about 9 months after working with him, he introduced me to an architect who he had gone to school with, who was doing kind of small commercial. So, small tenant finishes, banks, restaurants, things like that. So I really got a feel for some small variety. One of my husband and my favorite project was I did Casa de Pico, which is a great margarita place. If you guys are ever in San Diego, it's still there. So yeah, learning about different kinds of architecture. But during my architecture program, part of the 5-year program is your 5th year, you do a thesis. So I started studying the adaptive reuse of industrial buildings. So looking at Lowell, Massachusetts, looking at this building down here in the middle, which is the REI flagship building in Denver, which is the old Denver tramway building, which is the big steam engines that ran all of our cable car systems. So during that research project is when I really started thinking I wanted to go historic. mostly because I was tired of doing stucco and clay tile designs in Southern California, which was just everything was stucco and clay tile. So I really wanted to get, back into brick, things that we really don't necessarily use a ton anymore. So I started realizing that historic preservation was probably where I wanted to go. Next slide, please, Ash. So I looked into some programs and realized that Cornell's was highly regarded, and not ever actually being east of the Mississippi. I think it was quite a process when I got into our moving van, and I think we got to like Indiana, and I was like, wait a minute, where are we going? Who's this? Anyway, it was kind of a realization that I kind of took a leap of faith. I was looking into actually doing structural design, urban planning, but historic preservation just really drew me in. So chose the Cornell program and never looked back. So I'd say one of the most beneficial things about the program was I already knew I wanted to be an architect. I had been working at that point for about 3.5 years, and I found a firm in Ithaca. It's a very small amount of architects around at the time. So I interviewed at the 3 or 4 firms that were in town and ended up getting a job at Holt Architects. So then I transitioned into working on healthcare, higher education. One of the projects I did was this survey and assessment of some of the sorority and fraternity houses around Cornell. So as those of you who probably know Ithaca history, a lot of the fraternities and sorority houses are actually old Hollywood, back when Ithaca was the Hollywood of the East. A lot of mansions from those early actors, which was really fascinating to me. So this is Rockledge, which is one of the cool ones in my memory, but I also learned a lot about fraternities that I did not know before then. I'd say probably one of my most beneficial aspects of my overall education was just working while I was going to school, because I really learned a lot. And also it freed me up when we got to the point where we could kind of explore other parts of the university. I took, a farm workers class, which was really interesting, talking about, transitional workers through the US. I took a couple legal classes, things that really just piqued my interest, but didn't necessarily tailor towards what I really wanted to do. I did go after the Clarence Stein grant and was awarded. One of the reasons I went after it was because I realized that Clarence Stein originally worked in the office of Bertram Goodhue, who is the architect of the San Diego Exposition. So if you've ever been to San Diego, Balboa Park, he was the lead architect of that. And then I also found that Clarence Stein worked on the planning of Tyrone, New Mexico, which was a company town in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, mining company town. So I was really fascinated by the dichotomy of kind of the intent of architecture. So in the case of the San Diego Exposition, they built those buildings most of the buildings to be temporary, and then everybody fell in love with them. So there was this huge process of trying to preserve them and keep them going when they were built to be, most of them were built to be temporary. And then versus Tyrone, New Mexico, where they wanted to sort of establish a company town that would have a lot of amenities for workers. That was obviously built to last. And then shortly after it was
7
built,
minutes, Natalie.
Thank you. Shortly after it was built, it was all torn down because of the silver crash. So it was a really fascinating research project. I liked it a lot, obviously. Next slide, please. So when I got back to Colorado, of course, 2008 was a terrible time for architecture. I took a job actually for a large aviation company, so designing airports, which was not at all preservation. Spent a lot of time tearing down really cool airports, and it tore my heart out. So as soon as things started to look better in the economy here, I was able to get my first job actually as a preservation architect, which is in this cool Art Deco building here up at the right. So I worked at Humphreys Pulley for 5 years, and then met my now business partner, who was actually at a competing firm. And her and I decided to give a try. For those of you who aren't familiar with architects, as you move up in the company, you actually do less and less actual architecture. So we realized we really wanted to do projects. So we went out on our own in 2017, and it's been over 5 years now. And we are loving it. We are getting to do work all over the state and the country, working for the Park Service as a consultant, working on the Colorado State Capitol, which is just a dream come true. A lot of the mining structures, everything is different. It's all unique, and I love every minute of it. And I think that wraps me up. Oh, here's some more. And here I am back at Mesa Verde. So it's all full circle.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. This was a fabulous discussion, and I think everyone in the audience can kind of see how each of us had a very unique trajectory in different aspects. So I want to quickly pose some questions for the panelists, and then maybe we'll keep a couple of minutes for audience questions as well. So one of the questions that I'd like all of you to think about is, what aspects of preservation education were most beneficial for your career path?
Do you want to just go back alphabetically?
In order.
Yeah, let's do that. So Ed.
All right. So while I can't say that I use every course I took at Cornell on a regular basis, I don't have much opportunity to apply what I learned in preservation law, for instance. I think I probably utilize the theory of preservation more than anything else. It's so fundamental to what I do. I don't even think about it when I'm doing it. Sometimes it's just the rote application of the Secretary's standards to a project. Sometimes it's delving deeper into philosophical areas like, how far should I restore this sculpture? Do I call for a Dutchman to match the original appearance of the stonework, or should it follow the weathered appearance of adjacent stones? That kind of stuff comes up all the time, nearly every day. Another quick example. So right now in our studio, we have a cement sculpture from the 1920s that normally lives in front of the Harlem River Houses, which is a public housing project in New York City. It depicts a mother holding a child with a dog at her feet. It's missing its head and much of the dog. It's hollow and was supported by an armature made from iron pipe that corroded. The thin cement walls are severely cracked, and the sculpture looks like it's made of a bunch of ill-fitting puzzle pieces. This sculpture is a can of worms. Actually, I think it was full of spiders. But someone else had conserved it in the past, but now those repairs had failed. So a lot of philosophy and theory goes into conserving something like that. Do we stabilize what's left of the sculpture and stop there without reconstructing the head and other missing elements because we can't reproduce them exactly from the information we have? Or do we take a stab at making a new head from old photos? Because without it, this thing looks kind of scary and does not really convey the artist's original intent. Do we restore what remains knowing that it will continue to deteriorate once it's placed back outside? Or do we take a mold and make a replica of the original that'll last another 100 years? And tell the client to put the original in a museum somewhere. So while I probably won't dig out my copy of the Athens Charter or the SPAB Manifesto to answer those questions, it really does help to have a thorough understanding of why we do what we do and the ramifications of how we do it.
Great, thank you, Ed. Maya?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it was just being exposed to the variety of research methods through all the different courses that we had, which, I've applied in so many different ways. And, just using examples when I'm now working with people who are like deploying desktop research for me, or, for example, like when I worked for the city planning department, we were using water tap records to identify the age of the buildings because everything had been destroyed in the fire. So it's just like looking at things in different ways. I think the classes that did focus on the economics piece and tax credits were really helpful to me. And it was something that maybe I wouldn't have thought that I could excel in. And so getting that kind of exposure, gave me confidence moving forward. And then finally, throughout my career, ever since leaving Cornell, I've just always done a lot of community engagement. And so, that can look a lot of different ways. And some of those courses were within the HPP program, and some were ones that I pursued in the bigger kind of MRP classes that we had available to us. But I've just found those applicable in a lot of different ways, whether we're talking about a specific issue in the neighborhood, or now I deploy a lot of specific community engagement strategies on the projects that I do for my firm.
Great, thank you. Natalie?
Yeah, I think I kind of offered it up, but I think part of it was, working while I was going to school kind of helped create that real world connection of what does preservation in architecture really look like? And then also the travel and the hands-on, like the work weekends, meeting with specialists, learning so much about the actual practice that was happening around us. And then I think definitely, just to echo what everybody else has said, is the theorizing. So, it's very different when I'm looking at a project at the state capitol versus an old mill structure, and considerations of, are we going to dump millions of dollars into this wood structure in the high mountains that was really not meant to be, versus the Colorado State Capitol, which was obviously built to last. So really thinking about all those theories and how are you going to approach a project because of those things. So.
Okay, great. And then I can kind of briefly add that, in addition to what all of you mentioned, definitely sort of the various kinds of research methods that we were introduced to, and then I was able to also add to through the PhD program. All of those have had a huge impact in the last few years on the kind of work that I'm able to do. One of the most beneficial things from my perspective, was this idea that there are all of these different kinds of perspectives out there. There are all of these different contexts that people come from, and learning from them, from their context, and listening to what they are saying has been a really interesting and good experience for me over the years, particularly as I found myself in a classroom, sometimes with 200 or more students, to really begin to sort of, internalize how, when I came here as a student myself, not having any context, and then how other folks listened to me, and I was able to listen to both my classmates and CRP students more broadly, and faculty interactions and all of those. Those were all incredibly helpful experiences that have shaped my own career, or I have been able to incorporate that in my own career so far. So all of those, in addition to, of course, what everyone said, has been incredibly helpful. Angela, how are we doing on time? Do we have another time for another question, or should we just quickly open it up to the audience?
I think it would be best to open up to the audience now, because we have 2 more minutes. Yeah.
Yep, sounds good. So we will stop here and then open it up to the audience.
Thank you so much, Ashima. Do we have any questions? No. Oh, can I just add one thing? I think one common thread through all the 4 experiences that you all shared was about how the program is very flexible. And like you said, Ashima, that I see what kind of diverse group of students you all must have been for your batch. And we kind of have something similar. And me being an international student, studying with 2 PhD students, and with the architecture background, we don't really do much in writing. So it's been a very good learning experience from Jeff, and Zach, who's not here for the symposium, but just learning their research. And you'll have seen Jeff's research, and it at times can be very intimidating, but yeah, that's, I think, one more aspect of preservation education, because it's such a field which is open to all. It attracts a diverse crowd, even as students.
Great, thank you, Angela. I think if there are no other questions, we can end the session. We did have a lot more questions planned, but we are running out of time. So we can end here for now.
Yeah.
But thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think maybe we
Thank
can
you,
everyone.
can we break for 5 minutes and then get back at 7:05? Does that work with everybody? Yeah. Okay, I'll see you all at 7:05.
I think we can continue talking about this subject in the next roundtable as well. So stick around.